Welcome, fellow travelers of the forgotten roads and wanderers of wilds to the Verdant Enclave. I'm your host and sometimes friendly DM. More relevant to today's discussion, I'm also your fellow wanderer and wilderness guide to the Ranger class of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons.
There have been two primary questions I am examining in this adventure, but I chose to add an extension to one of them, as it is a statement I have heard before in relation to Rangers. The original two questions are, does the Ranger need Hunter's Mark in order to do comparable damage, and are fighters better as archers than Rangers? The extended question is, do Rangers need their spells in order to keep up with martial class damage output? To clarify, comparable should be understood as equivalent. In other words, in order for the question to be regarded as true, Rangers would be required to use Hunter's Mark in order to do the same damage as a fighter, or a paladin, or a rogue, or any of the other martial classes. If they don't need Hunter's Mark to do this, then the question is not true. There are some points on which I would like to provide some context for, especially the house rule glancing blow. My players, and myself, didn't like missing by only 1 point on the attack roll. Originally when this occurred I was letting players choose an outcome, either favorable or unfavorable, but that was proving uninteresting, so instead I implemented this idea of letting the attack hit, but only for half damage, as though the target had been granted temporary resistance. However, I do record the damage at the number rolled, the same as I do for creatures who have resistance or vulnerability. Something I wanted to address as well is how I'm counting damage for spells like Spike Growth versus something like the briefly used Thunder Wave. Both spells can affect more than one person, but with Thunder Wave and Magic Missile, the damage is rolled once, rather than every time someone moves through the area of the spell. Therefore, I record the 1 damage roll per use of spells like Magic Missile, even if it hits more than one target, because the total damage dealt cannot exceed the number rolled, regardless of whether the damage is split or dealt all to one target. Meanwhile, I record each total rolled by Spike Growth and report the cumulative damage, because the number changes every time a creature moves through a space. Further, spell damage will be tracked for the purpose of determining each level's overall damage per level, but unless it is a damage rider, it will not be a factor in calculating average damage per hit, as the spell damage isn't necessarily dependent on whether or not a weapon attack hits. Finally, while most optimizers build their characters and determine the quality by estimating, through one means or another, average damage per round, from my perspective and the way I'm tracking the data, I am not evaluating the data on a per round basis, but on a per hit basis, as it's simply easier for me to keep track of that way. With that out of the way, let's get started with the rogue. Thea has now progressed from level 7 through level 8. At level 7, Thea made 68 attacks and 60 hits, for a hit to attack ratio of 88.24%. Sneak attack added 946 points, which was 64.57% of the level's overall damage. Cunning action was used to hide successfully 40 out of 49 attempts, disengage was used 5 times, dash 16 times, fast hands 8 successful times out of 9, and second story work was used twice. Sharpshooter at level 7 was used 1 time, successfully, for 10 points of damage, or 0.68% of level overall damage. At level 8, Thea made 63 attacks and 58 hits, for a hit to attack ratio of 92.06%. Sneak attack added 787 points, or 61.29% of that level's total damage. Cunning action was used to hide successfully 28 out of 30 attempts, 12 times to disengage, 7 times to dash, and Fast Hands was used 4 times successfully. Sharpshooter was used 3 times, but only once successfully for 10 more points, or 0.78% of total level damage. Uncanny Dodge was used 17 times, reducing damage taken by a total of 89 points. At level 7, Thea dealt 519 points of straight weapon damage, and 946 from sneak attack. Thea made 497 points of weapon damage at level 8, and 787 from sneak attack. Thea's level 7 average per hit was 24.42, and 22.14 at level 8. Adrian completed level 8, during which he made 83 attacks for 76 hits, for a hit-to-attack ratio of 91.57%. His weapon attacks totaled 594 points of damage. Firebolt was used 13 times for 130 points of damage, or 16% of total level damage. Expeditious Retreat was cast 4 times, enabling him to dash 19 times with his bonus action. Darkness was used twice, and Shield was used 9 times. Magic Missile was used 4 times for a total of 45 points, or 5% of total level damage. The Staff of Paralysis was used 3 times successfully. Action Surge was used 5 times, the second to cast Magic Missile, and added 46 points of damage, or 7% of total level damage. Second Wind was used 4 times, recovering 55 hit points. Over the course of level 8, Adrian accumulated 827 points of damage, 77.39% of which was due to weapon attacks, and 22.61% due to magic, none of which were damage rider types of spells. With the weapon damage divided by hits, including Action Surge, Adrian's average per hit was 8.42, or 1.38 points below the baseline. Without Action Surge, then the average damage per hit drops to 7.81, 1.99 points below the baseline. Varen made 138 hits out of 142 attacks, for a hit-to-attack ratio of 97.18%. Longstrider was used 4 times, 3 extra times at second level into Thea's ring. Jump was cast 4 times, and cast twice more into Thea's ring. Locate Animals or Plants was used 0 times, and Spike Growth was used 7 times for 2,840 points of damage, or 64% of total level damage. Natural Explorer was used 29 times, and Favored Enemy was used 5 times. Colossus Slayer was used 68 times for 336 points, or 21% of total level damage. Primeval Awareness was used 4 times, and Steel Will was used once successfully. Varen's total level 8 damage was 4,460 points, 36.32% of which was due to weapon damage, and 63.68% due to spell damage. Including Colossus Slayer, Varen's average damage per hit was 11.74, or 1.94 above the baseline, 3.93 above the fighter without Action Surge, or 3.32 above the fighter with Action Surge. Varen's average damage per hit with Colossus Slayer was 10.4 below the Rogue using Sneak Attack, but 3.17 above the Rogue without Sneak Attack. Varen used no damage rider type spells. Here are the 3 classes as they have progressed so far. For the purposes of this comparison, I've removed the effect Colossus Slayer, Action Surge, and Sneak Attack have on the averages, as well as any magical considerations. Almost right away we notice that the Rogue's average per hit, indicated by the yellow line, continues to rise past where it jumped to at level 3, as high as 14.17 at level 5, only to be followed by a significant drop at level 6, and now even a gradual decline over levels 7 and 8. Some context might help explain this. The rogue took sharpshooter at level 4, which can add damage to each hit, but also the rogue has fewer hits because the rogue does not get an extra attack feature. This means that damage can be boosted even though the denominator, the hits, remains small, which therefore raises the average. What this line indicates is that the rogue, without sneak attack, is an extremely efficient damage dealer, able to pack a lot of power into a single hit. But it's not entirely reliable, as the average damage wanders wildly between highs and lows. The gray line represents the fighter's average per hit, which is shockingly lower than the baseline at many points. Again, context matters here. The fighter can generate more attacks per turn than the rogue can, which means what damage they can deal is divided across more hits, thus reducing the efficiency of the fighter. Also, the fighter chose a feat at level 4 like the rogue did, which means that the fighter's attack ability did not increase, reducing both damage overall and their chance to hit their target. Finally, though being designed to be an archer to compare more directly against the ranger, the player has chosen to rely primarily on sword and shield, which means that the fighter rarely utilizes their archery fighting style, which further reduces their chance to hit. Speaking of the ranger, represented by the orange line, we see that the ranger maintains a respectable margin above the baseline, as well as a rather more consistent result. With less choices to make than the fighter per turn, and more attacks per turn to make than the rogue, this results in the ranger being more focused on dealing damage than the fighter, and a higher chance to hit than the rogue, especially because instead of choosing a feat, the ranger chose to focus on increasing their primary battle attribute. But what happens when we add in the class features? The first thing we notice is that the rogue's sneak attack enhances even more the turn-by-turn efficiency of the rogue's attack. There is a tremendous difference between the rogue's averages and the other two, but rather than showing consistency, there is a great deal of shifting along the rogue's yellow line, shooting up and down with dramatic effect. Partly this might be explained by the rogue relying heavily on the sharpshooter feat at first, as we see a dip in level 4's average, but then the rogue's average jumps at level 5 and plummets back down at level 6. Somewhere between level 5 and 6, the rogue's ability to generate or gain advantage, a preferred condition not only for hitting but for getting sneak attack damage, started running into complications. Monster movements, tactical priorities, and environmental factors inhibited the rogue's ability to hide, or negated the rogue's advantage. The fighter's gray line overall certainly improved with the addition of Action Surge, but it seems to be struggling to break away from the blue baseline, possibly explained by the Eldritch Knight having a variety of spell options and other considerations to choose between for their action and bonus action expenditures. It should not be ignored that the fighter has been consistently relying on his short sword since level 4, which also deals a lower base damage die than the longbow. By the fighter's own admission, it felt to him as though he was doing more with sword and shield than with longbow. And tactically speaking, the player is not wrong. There have been several battles and moments in battle where the fighter's ability to draw attention to himself and avoid damage has directly and positively affected the battle's outcome, though it has apparently hindered the fighter's averages. The orange line of the ranger, while certainly not as dramatic as the rogue, rose higher again than the baseline, and is showing consistent returns, and a steady rise over the course of several levels. Recall, if you will, that the ranger took no feat, as the fighter and the rogue did, choosing to instead increase dexterity alongside their proficiency, and has Colossus Slayer almost constantly, with or without advantage or conveniently placed enemies of targets, while the rogue has sometimes struggled to earn advantage in order to gain sneak attack. Further, the Ranger has a lot less to distract from the primary objective, which in combat is to attack and destroy the enemy. So while certainly less versatile on a given turn than the fighter or the rogue, it does seem to indicate that the Ranger's consequential, intense focus on attacking lends itself rather nicely to boosting average per hit. You may recall that I added a question for consideration, recalling the Ranger in comparison to the others. Specifically, do Rangers need their spells in order to be comparable to the other martial classes? Let's take a look at how that's going. Here are the characters' total damage outputs by level as covered so far, not including class features Action Surge, Colossus Slayer, or Sneak Attack, or special abilities such as Magic added in. So this is a strictly weapons-only damage. Following the gray bar for the Rogue, we see that, except at level 3, which as has been discussed, might be more an aberrant level for the Rogue rather than a consistent trend, the Rogue has struggled to keep up with the Fighter and the Ranger until 4th level, when the Rogue chose to take the Sharpshooter feat. If you noticed during the discussion on the Rogue's results, the Sharpshooter feat for the Rogue hit roughly about half the times it was used. But seeing as how it still enabled the Rogue to beat the Fighter's level 4 damage, this might not be a bad trade-off. However, at levels 5 and 6, the Rogue struggled while relying on Sharpshooter to even reach 50% of the Fighter's output. But at levels 7 and 8, has been relying less on Sharpshooter's added damage bonus, preferring to increase accuracy. Now, the Fighter, shown by the orange columns, really stepped into its own at level 5, skyrocketing above its previous levels with shocking ease. But without using Action Surge or Colossus Slayer, and without relying on Ranger Magic, the Ranger, shown by the blue column, has kept above the Fighter at every level. This is true even at the levels where the Fighter and Ranger were using the same weapons, had the same ability scores, and were facing the exact same enemies in the exact same circumstances. With that in mind, let's see what happens when Action Surge, Colossus Slayer, Sneak Attack, and Magic are all added in. Now, with all features and Magic added in, we get a much clearer picture. While the Rogue is more efficient at packing damage into a single hit so far, it has trouble with producing reliably growing levels of damage with its advancing levels, until hitting level 7 and 8, relying heavily on Sneak Attack's increasing dice pool. With Action Surge and the Eldritch Knight's access to Magic, the Fighter competes fairly evenly with the Rogue up until level 5, at which point the Fighter gets extra attack and goes to town with it. This did not, however, enable the Fighter to surpass the Ranger. If you recall the previous chart, the Ranger was ahead of the others without using Magic and without using Colossus Slayer. With both those added in, the Ranger has simply flown on ahead, simply adding magic damage on top of the weapons, and not entirely or solely relying on Hunter's Mark. Now, to be fair, we have completed only 8 levels out of 20, or 40% of the possible levels of gameplay. At each level, except for the potentially aberrant level 3 for the Rogue, the Ranger has outperformed the others in total damage per level. Except for level 1, when the Fighter gains their fighting style, the Ranger has consistently outperformed the Fighter for average per hit. Further, Magic has not thus far been shown to be necessary for the Ranger in order to achieve this. Even at level 8, where Spike Growth added so much damage, it barely contributed to more than 50% of what the Ranger could do. Well, I hope you're finding this analysis as interesting as I am, and that you will continue to explore the Ranger class with me, as well as joining Adrian, Thea, and Varen in the Land of the Hunter. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.